Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the camp. And welcome to new camp members. It is good to see you all. Today, I'm going to continue the reading of The Girl from the Dream. So, gather around, get comfortable, grab a snack as we dive in to today's story. Last time I was reading, he had been sitting there for a few minutes before picking up the pen. He wrote, "Dear Diary, I had the dream again. The horrible nightmare with the disgusting voice. It called me again. The sound of her voice in the dark forest sent chills down my spine. I stand again in front of the window with the curtain drawn and listen to her voice. It is disgusting, grim, yes, totally terrifying, but still, it is spellbinding. I can't close my ears because I want to hear her voice, her sad but shuddering voice. It captures me, but scares me. I look into the forest to find her because I want to see her, but she's not there. She's just a voice in the wind. A light breeze with biting cold. I open my mouth, but no words come out. Again, it is the same every time. No words, only her voice. I'm suddenly pulled out of my room and standing in the forest. It is cold. There are no sounds out here. I look around and I see dead bodies. People who is in decay. People who are hanged, shot, and burned. I see people who have drowned. They're floating in the air, but they're underwater. The smell of corpses and death fills my nostrils. It is sickening. I want to throw up, but my throat knots itself, so nothing comes up. My stomach hurts. It burns. It is like someone is scratching me as they pull away with me. But all at once, I rush back to my room and again stand in front of the window and look out. I put my hand up to the window, hoping she sees me. I feel a shock in my hand. It doesn't hurt, but I get startled and wake up. I quickly sat up in bed and rushed over to write it down. But diary, why am I looking for her? Why do I want to hear her voice when she scares me out of my wits? Why do I want to see her? What does she look like? Is she beautiful? Is she hideous? Is she human? Or worse? I fear her, but I want her. Why? I don't know, diary. I really don't know." He put the pen down and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He leaned back a little and took a deep breath. He looked down at his stomach and pulled up his t-shirt. There were small scratch marks on it. He took his t-shirt back down and shook his head slightly. He closed the diary and stood up. He went out of the room and into the kitchen to get some water. He stood in front of the sink, opened the cupboard in front of him, reached out and took a glass. Then he turned on the tap and waited for the water to cool a little. He then put the glass under the beam and waited for it to fill up. It wasn't exactly going fast, but it didn't matter to him. Suddenly, he heard something. The hairs on his back and arms all stood up. Chills ran down his back. He turned pale and sank a lump. What he heard couldn't make sense. There was no way it was possible. He was focused on what he heard and completely forgot about the water. It ran over the glass and down his hands. It was freezing cold, but he didn't feel it. He stood for a while and heard the same sound again. It was her voice. The girl from the dream. But how? He thought. He quickly turned and dropped the glass. His kitchen was small and was in one with the living room. There was a small patio door between two small windows. It was right between the kitchen and the living room. Speedy looked towards it and couldn't move. He was frozen solid, paralyzed with terror. He didn't blink and didn't look away from the door. For one brief second, when he turned, he had seen a pale figure. It was not white as a ghost, but pale as a corpse. It quickly disappeared when Speedy saw it. He knew for sure that he saw it, that it was not just an optical illusion. He stood for a while, and then came to when he heard the faucet running behind him. He shivered slightly all over and turned off the tap. He then looked down and saw the shattered glass. He sighed lightly and squatted down to pick it up. As he picked up the pieces, he thought about the voice and what he saw. He knew it wasn't a dream. He was awake this time. He was focused on the voice, that he didn't notice that one of the shards of glass was slightly crooked, so that it had a point on it. He chased his hand down into it and cussed his index finger on it. He quickly pulled his hand to him and said, "God damn it!" He looked at his finger and saw there was a long gash from the top of the finger to almost the bottom of the finger. He stood up and put his hand under the faucet and let the water run over it. It was hurting. He had to bite his lower lip to keep from screaming. He turned off the tap and wrapped some paper towel around his finger as he searched for a first aid kit. He looked into the living room, into a bookcase, but it wasn't there, as it should be. He stood for a bit, humming as he held his left hand around his right to hold the paper towel. He then went into the kitchen to look, but when he went to the sink, with small hasty steps, he slipped in the water on the floor. He fell forward and tried to take it off with his hands, but it resulted in his hands slipping on the shards of glass that were still lying on the floor, so he hit his head on the floor. He ached and rolled onto his back. He raised a hand to his head and sat up. As he did so, he felt a violent pain in his hands. It gave an unpleasant rush, and he turned them to see what had happened. His eyes widened, and he saw that he had cut both hands right around the pulse. Blood spurted out and hit his clothes and face. He stood up and wanted to grab a tea towel that was hanging on the side of the fridge by the sink, but he was too groggy to grab it. He staggered past and staggered around the room for a bit before falling over. It all spun around and he became ill. He looked up but couldn't focus. He opened and closed his eyes all the time. But then he heard a familiar voice. It was her. Again. He tried to turn his head, but it didn't go so well. He just laid there, mumbling. Suddenly, it felt like she was touching his arm. Her hands were gently and lovely, but cold. Ice cold. One would think she was running an ice cube up his arm. Her hands were that cold. If it even were her. He didn't know what to believe. He only knew that he was dying. He tried to look at her, but he couldn't open his eyes. However, he managed to say, "Is it you?" She simply answered back quietly, "Shh, not yet, not yet." He tried to nod and close his eyes completely. Everything went black, and his whole body went limp. Speedy suddenly woke up from his sleep when his cell phone rang. It was on the desk. He rubbed his eyes and stood up. He felt a little strange in his body. While he was walking towards his phone, he said, Yeah, I'm coming." He didn't think too much of the strangeness in his body because he was too tired, too groggy, too sleepy. He went to the table and picked up his phone, raised it to his ear and said, hello?" He was so sleepy. On the other end, a man's voice said, "Hey, good morning, sleepy snout. Are you going to sleep all day or what?" It was his good friend Jake. Speedy just answered, "All day? What time is it?" "It's 10 to 12, man. Are you coming or what?" "Coming? Where? And why?" "How could you... Oh, God, Speedy. Did you forget it?" Forget what? Speedy just asked. My goodness. Damn you, Speedy. Jake was not in a good mood. Speedy just said, what? Speedy didn't know what Jake was talking about. He could hear Jake breathing heavily into the phone. Then Jake said, we were supposed to meet at the bar at 12 because it's my sister's birthday. Speedy suddenly remembered. Oh, right. Oh, I'm so sorry. But yeah, I'm coming out. Okay, I'll see you there. Then they hung up. He hurried to find some clothes, rushed into the bathroom, washed and got ready. He then got dressed and put on his outerwear and went out to his motorcycle. He suddenly became short-sighted and raised his head. What happened last night suddenly came back to him. He hurriedly looked at his hands and saw there was nothing. No scars, no blood. There was nothing there to begin with. He then said, wait a minute. Shouldn't I be dead? I cut myself pretty bad. He stood a little wondering about it. He then said, but her voice. I have to figure this out later. I have to go now. I really have to go. He then got out on his motorcycle, started it and drove off. At the bar he was driving towards was called the Red Angel and was in the middle of town. The town he lived in was called Little Shack. It had approximately 500 to 1,000 inhabitants. It was not the best known town in the USA, but he loved the little town and all that was in it. There was a supermarket, a gas station, and bar, which was very popular, and many other small shops where you bought clothes and other good things. On the way over to the Red Angel, he thought about the girl with the voice and about the night he had. Did it really happen? And what really happened? He knew he heard her in the kitchen and that he saw something. He also knew that he had cut himself, but now there was nothing. He actually felt good. A little weird maybe, but good. He had no scars or was in pain. He was perfectly fine. He became unsure of how much was real and how much was a dream. Maybe it was all a dream. But what he remembered the most was her touch. Her gently icy hands. They were like ice cubes of silk. He had his thoughts buried a little too much in her because he didn't see the car he was about to drive right into. He opened his eyes wide, gasped, and hurriedly turned away from the car. It honked at him violently as it passed him. Speedy thought it was embarrassing and pulled over to the side. He turned off his motorcycle and sat there. Adrenaline pumped violently in him and he breathed quickly and heavily. He then said to himself, "Oh man, what's wrong with me today? I'm totally inattentive." He shook his head again and started up his motorcycle and drove on. He finally reached the bar and saw Jake standing there waiting for him. Speedy hoped Jake wasn't too mad at him because he actually had a good reason for being a little late. Speedy took a deep breath and parked his motorcycle. He took off his helmet and saw Jake in the side mirror. He said quietly, "All right, here we go." Speedy stood up and placed his helmet on the seat. He turned and waited for Jake. He took another deep breath and was ready for confrontation. Jake got a little mad, but was otherwise very calm. Speedy told him that he was late because he almost ran into a car. Jake asked if he was okay. Speedy nodded and said that he was. Then they put their arms around each other and went inside and found their friends. Inside was Alexander, Eddie, Melissa, Judith, Frank, Peter, and a lot of others. They had a beer and Speedy congratulated Jake's sister. They stood there talking to his friends for a while. He ended up going to a corner in a booth and sat down. He drank another beer, and then he ordered another one, and another one. As he was sitting there drinking beer number 4, he was looking around the room, just looking at all of them. He liked to see his friends having a good time and enjoying themselves. But among all his friends, and whoever there were of strangers, he saw a girl. One he hadn't seen before. She was eye-catching. She stood out and was breathtaking. He couldn't take his eyes off her. She was so beautiful that his eyes could not believe what he saw. She had shorter than shoulder-length dark hair that was put up in a ponytail and was wearing a short yellow dress. He just sat there and stared at her. She stood with her side to him a good distance out on the floor. Then she turned her head towards him and smiled. She was the most beautiful and lovely thing he had ever seen. But somehow she seemed so familiar. He sat with his head tilted slightly and scratched his chin. Then she smiled again and disappeared into the crowd. He quickly sat up and looked for her, but he couldn't see her. Then he heard it. The voice. The familiar, terrifying voice. The voice that called his name. The shuddering but seductive voice. She stood up quickly and was pale. He eagerly looked around to find her. It was the girl from the dream. He saw the girl from the dream. He was sure of it. She was right in front of him and he was too blind to see it. He cursed at himself and went into the crowd. He just had to find her, no matter what. He had to have answers. He looked and looked, but he couldn't find her. Alexander, with a drink in his hand, bumped into him. He spilled some and turned around. He was mad at first, but smiled when he saw Speedy. He raised a hand and said, "Hey, Speedy, what's up, dude?" It was obvious that Alexander had been drinking. Speedy smiled crookedly back and replied, "Hello, Alex. Not so much. By the way, did you see that girl there?" The girl?" Alex replied. "Oh, you mean Jake's sister? Yeah. She's nice too, man. Woo!" Speedy just stood there and said, "What? No, not her. The other one. The one with the brown hair. She was standing right there just a moment ago." Alexander looked at Speedy in confusion and said, "Dude, what girl?" Speedy looked back strangely and replied, "The girl, beautiful, young. She was right there. She had brown hair and she... He paused and thought about it. He suddenly couldn't describe her. In fact, he could barely remember her. Alexander put a hand on him, looked at him a little seriously, and said, "Dude, I may be drunk, but I would have been able to remember a beautiful girl with brown hair, as you're saying. But there's no such girl in here." Speedy looked at me a little scared. Alexander then asked, Are you okay, Speedy?" Speedy stood there for a bit. He couldn't believe what Alexander just said. He wouldn't believe it. Speedy shook his head briefly and said, Yeah, I'm fine. You know what, I'm not feeling too good, so I have to go." "Oh, really? But you haven't been here that long." I don't think it was that long." Speedy didn't say anything and just looked at him. Alexander turned to the other friends and said, "Hey, let's party! Woo!" Then he left, and that suited Speedy just fine. Because then he could escape from there. He pushed his way through the people and went to the door, took his jacket and went out. He rushed to his motorcycle, got on it, started it, and quickly drove away from there. The whole trip home he thought about the girl. He kept thinking she was right in front of him. He couldn't believe it. She was finally there. And he didn't even realize it. When he reached his home, he jumped off his motorcycle, took off his helmet, and walked right to the front of the door. He opened it and suddenly wandered into the forest. The dark, familiar forest. He took a few steps and stopped. He looked around and was confused, completely confused. How had he ended up there, he thought. He walked forward cautiously and heard the voice again. He listened carefully for it and followed it, wherever it came from. She called his name. He knew it was her who called him. He went on, but suddenly felt lightheaded. He slowed down and reached for his head. He became dizzy and ill. He leaned against a tree and stopped completely. He looked down and everything turned in his stomach, but nothing came up. He then looked up and looked around a bit. Suddenly, he felt a strange sensation in his body. He looked ahead and suddenly, out of the blue, something came flying towards him. It was her, the girl. She quickly rushed at him, very, very quickly, and said, "You're mine." She wasn't pretty anymore. She was scary and creepy. She had fangs, gray skin, and red wild eyes. He held out his arm and shouted, "No!" He suddenly sat up and breathed quickly and heavily. He looked to the side and saw his desk. He was suddenly lying in his bed, back in his room. He was sweating and said, "What on earth is happening?" He just sat there and said nothing. Then he got up and went over to the desk to write the episode down in his diary. A few days then passed. During the day, he seemed to see the girl from the dream in several places in the town. In the supermarket, in the bar, in the workshop, and a few other places. But every time he walked towards her, she walked away and disappeared. He looked for her, but it was like she was sunk into the ground or just vanished to thin air. A few days later, in the evening, he again sat in front of the diary. He sat with the pen in his hands, shaking. He was sweating. It was cold outside and especially cold inside. He gulped and just stared at his open journal. He had just another nightmare. He quietly moved the pen to the paper and wrote, "Dear diary, I had the dream again. The same dream. I don't know how many times I had that dream. The horrible, horrible nightmare. And the voice. I heard her voice again. Each time it calms me down, but scares me. I hate it, but I love it. I must have her. I reach out for her. My heart screams for her, but my brain screams stop. What should I do? I feel her presence. Even now, I feel like I'm going crazy. Am I going crazy? Is she real? Is she a dream? Does she even exist?" He put the pen down and sat back a little in his chair. He looked up and sighed deeply. He could feel something inside him. Something pulled at him. He felt his high head lighten up, but at the same time he became a little lightheaded. He suddenly looked towards the window and there she was, the girl from the dream. He opened his eyes wide and couldn't believe it. He got up and walked towards the window. She smiled and put a hand on the window. He did the same, so their hands met. He looked at their hands for a bit. It felt so unreal, like a dream. He then looked at her and asked, "Who are you? And what is your name?" She answered with a lovely and bright voice, "My name is Jenny, and I'm your soulmate. Come along, my love. Let's be together forever." He said the name to himself quietly, almost in a whisper. Jenny. It was the most beautiful name he ever heard. He nodded at her and said, "All right, let's go." He then walked out to her. They took each other's hands and walked together into the night. The end. And that is all I have for you today, my fellow camp members. I really hope you enjoyed my story. And if you like this type of content, please remember to subscribe and like the video and comment down below. And if you want more of these kind of stories, like my own stories I have written, then feel free to come back another day. And I will also will continue to read other people's stories as well. So feel free to submit your story to me at serioustourist@hotmail.com. So, well, until next time, I will see you, and this is good night.